Come on, you little bitch. Right up, sluts. No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Elo, Dibre, Elohim, Chaim. But this is the Missouri live by. Today is 14th of Sivan, 5786. Saturday, May 30th. This shit sucks, dog. It's the worst. Everything sucks. 155 days of this bitch. Worst stream ever. You just watch the same bullshit. Yeah. 3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. 3631, 130, son of Adam was born. 3526, 235, Enosh, son of Seth was born. 3436, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh was born. 3366, 395, Mahala, son of Kenan was born. 3301, 460, Yared, son of Mahala was born. 3139, 622, Hanak, son of Yared was born. 3074, 687, Methuselah, son of Hanak was born. This shit is the worst. Coffee and Kabbalah, Kabbalah and coffee. Really? It's the worst, dog. This shit is terrible. Terrible. Come on, you little bitch. This thing is the worst. The worst. Really? It's fucking awful. Come on. I'm supposed to be on a podcast today, but it sucks. It's the worst. Shut up. HB to GD. Really? Oh, yeah. Everybody knows that. Come on, you little bitch. 78. Israel. Will there be 79? Who knows? For Israel? Oh, of course, no doubt. Come on, you little bitch. Dog, this thing is sucking so much cock. Scale is 0 to 10. And cock sucking? 10. Really? Oh, this is the worst. Come on, dog. Are you fucking serious? Dude, 86 says bitch. Reload. Come on, you Jezebel and hoe. Whenever I'm waiting on these fucking things, I always think like, dude, it's the most important thing in my life. And then once I get it, it's like, never remembered it, never to be remembered again.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel into the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics as esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism and hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. So, as we talked about last time, the Sefer Zohar is a kind of mystical midrash composed of a bunch of uneven sections that has become the core of the Kabbalah. In fact, it is now the core of the Kabbalah. It's the most recently added scripture of Judaism after the Talmud. The Talmud and the midrash literature is a kind of scripture, and the Zohar has now become a kind of scripture as well, depending on the community, especially in the Orthodox world, less so in the liberal world. It's composed by Moshe Leon, who circle around him sometime in the 13th century, although it's traditionally ascribed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who's a 2nd century sage. And some of the core concepts we talked about last time are Shekhinah. This is the idea that God has a feminine aspect. And that Shekhinah, that feminine aspect of God, dwells in our world. That is how we experience God, is through God's feminine aspect. And part of what's going on in the Kabbalistic drama, in the Kabbalistic theory, is that the goal in some level of Kabbalah is a kind of sacred marriage between Israel, the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah in Israel, and the upper Sephirim. We'll talk about how that's accomplished in just a second. And as you may remember last time too, when we talked about the concept of evil in the Zohar, unlike the previous, more philosophical theories of evil, in which evil was simply a privation, you can think of cold being the absence of hot, or darkness being the absence of light. The Zohar rejects that theory and says, no, evil is very real. It's actually part of the dross. It's an afterbirth in terms of how reality is created. And that afterbirth comes, or that dross is thrown off by Gugura, judgment, or justice. It's Gugura overcome. It's Gugura is overcome in such a way that Chesed doesn't check it, and when Chesed or mercy and love doesn't check the Gugura, that overflow of judgment becomes evil. And that forms a different dimension of reality called Sitra Achra, the other side. And that other side is where the opposite of God lives. This is the realm of the demonic. And the Zohar is very, very, very concerned about the realm of the demonic. It has, in fact, very complex, a couple of different complex, very demonological systems. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all those demonological systems, but we could in another, maybe if we do a whole Zohar class, we could get into Zohar demonology. As I mentioned also, right, the Zohar is hyper literal. It likes to take things very, very seriously. Remember I said that one of the things that the Zohar likes to read into the Bible is anywhere the direct object marker, et, occurs in Hebrew. I think someone pointed out in the chat last time that the word et occurs everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Of course it does. Everywhere there is a direct object in the sentence, the word et appears in Hebrew. And so people say, yeah, the Shekhinah must be everywhere. And that's what et means according to the Zohar. Anytime there's an et, that means the Shekhinah is there. And people say, well, that means the Shekhinah is everywhere. Of course Shekhinah is everywhere. Because God is everywhere. and God only appears as Shekhinah in our realm according to the Zohar. Now, how do we deal with this hyperliteralism? And well, we deal with it with kind of conservatism when it comes to Jewish law, and that takes the form that the Zohar is very, very liberal about the doing of Jewish law. It does not interpret the Jewish law metaphorically. It says that if the Torah tells you to put the tefillin on every day, you do it. And not only do you do it, that is the key to seducing Shekhinah. And I didn't talk about this much last time, and I should have. It was a mistake of mine. That the Zohar likes to describe the commandments, the following of the commandments, as something like foreplay or seducing God. And as we seduce God by following the commandments, we become married to God through a scene. We become married to God through a kind of marriage. And that marriage to God is exactly what's supposed to happen to redeem the world. That is to say, the masculine, the feminine, all these things are balanced, and that balance is the metaphysical ideal that the Zohar aims for. And so, the following of the law is not just an optional thing in the Zohar. The following of the Jewish law, scrupulously following the Jewish law, Shabbat, laying tefillin, keeping Shabbat, separating meat and milk, all the 613 rules that you know and love. Those are not just rules to follow, they are the roadmap by which one Israel seduces God into the sacred marriage. And in that sacred marriage, the cosmos is repaired. And that reparation of the cosmos is the goal of the Kabbalah as it's understood by the Zohar. And so there is no Kabbalah. There's no Kabbalah for the writer of the Zohar without scrupulous halakhic attention to the Jewish law. And that's one point I want to drive home. I'm not trying to say that non-Jewish people can't appreciate Kabbalah, that non-Jewish people can't learn from Kabbalah. I'm saying that the writer of the Zohar does not imagine that there is a Kabbalah, not just outside of Judaism, that's not even imaginable. There's no Kabbalah outside of a strict Orthodox Judaism. And so the idea of Tikkun Olam is helping the world and repairing the world by giving charity and doing activism. The writer of the Zohar would say, sure, but you got to do the other stuff too. It's not enough to give charity and help make the world better materially. You have to very carefully keep the law. You have to make sure that you don't wear clothes that have linen and wool blended together in shackles, because that destroys the universe. That destroys the cosmos when you do that. You have to make sure to accept it. And by observing that, you have to balance it. So it's a very legalistic mysticism. And I know that the phrase legalistic mysticism sounds bizarre to us because we think of mysticism as kind of pervasive. It's just feeling and emotion. It's just experience. But that's not true for Kabbalah. It's about obedience and transcendence. It's about immanence and transcendence. You have to balance both. So now again, I'm not trying to gatekeep here and say that non-Jewish people can't appreciate Kabbalah. I'm just saying this is what the Zohar says. Does that mean you have to accept what the Zohar says? Do what the hell you want. It's your business. I'm just telling you, don't let anyone tell you that it's kumbaya in the Zohar. Because that's just not true. Now, does that mean that you have to be bound to that? No. So I don't want to lie to you. I'm going to tell you some hippy-dippy kumbaya Zohar. I'm to be honest about what it says. Now, what it says and what to do with it are two different questions. What to do with it is what you have to do. That's your business. All I'm here to, what I have to do responsibly from my end is tell you what it says, and I'll from there. Let's jump in, folks. Let's jump in. So, the main thing I want to drive home tonight is that when we tell the story of the Zohar, sometimes we tell the story of philosophy, that there was a bunch of Greek people and a bunch of medieval people, and then Descartes happened, and nothing happened in between. It's as if there were a bunch of Greek people and there were a bunch of medieval people, and then Descartes happened. And as if nothing happened in the middle of all that. Sometimes we do the same mistake when it comes to the Zohar or the Kabbalah. We pretend that the Zohar got written, and then Isaac Luria came, and then everything was done. And the Kabbalah has not changed since then, and the Kabbalah was not there before that, right? And that story is just incorrect. What's really important to know is that the appearance of the Zohar beginning in the 1790s and then through the early 14th century, it didn't make huge waves. It wasn't a big deal. Many people did not buy into it. It wasn't widely disseminated, and many people didn't know about it. It slowly began to percolate through Europe, and then eventually Italy, and eventually to the east, and the Morocco, of course, as well. What's important to know is that it just didn't make it wasn't a big splash at first. It was mostly the purview of a very tiny group of people who did not make it public. And can you blame them? We just talked about all kinds of weird stuff the Zohar teaches. Do you want to be the guy who gets the first couple pages of Zohar and goes to your local rabbi and tells him that you believe this? No. You're going to sound like a crazy person. The Zohar sounds crazy now. Do you really want to be the person to go and be like, yeah, preach it from the mountaintop. Let's talk about Zohar in 1310 in a village in Germany. People are like, you mean that we have to get married to God? What are you talking about? They're going to think you're a crazy heretic. And so what ends up happening is the Zohar is kind of parceled out in sections. It's sent all around. People are carrying chunks of it. No one's really going to publicize it. People are still playing the cards pretty close to their chest. Because again, this is a pretty dangerous time to be Jewish. This is a pretty dangerous time to be a heretic. You do not want to become a heretic. You don't. That's a death sentence in many ways. And so the Zohar and Kabbalah are still being played pretty close to the chest. Also around this time, it's not like the Zohar ended with the Zohar. Now that's a weird thing to say, but what ends up happening is that after the Zohar as we have it is kind of done, there are Zoharic-like documents that get produced after the Zohar, the most famous of which is a document called the Tikkun Zohar, another is the Ra'aya Mehimna, and these two documents are actually probably produced in the same group of people that produced the Zohar, but they're not quite the same. But they're so essential to the Zohar that they're kind of Zohar-like. So much so that in the modern version of the Zohar, they're attached to the Zohar. They're kind of like an appendage, like an apocrypha. They're kind of like Zohar apocrypha. That's maybe not quite true, but they're put there, and they're not quite the same as the Zohar. Although I will say that in the modern Daniel Matt edition, that's the 12-volume massive Daniel Matt edition that's out now, he does not translate Ra'aya Mehimna. Although Tikkun Zohar and Ra'aya Mehimna in many ways are more popular because they're more coherent than the actual Zohar itself was. These are kind of like digests of Zohar material. So we also have the Zohar has a kind of half-life. So we have the main Zohar, then we have the half-life of the Zohar. And it sort of continues to exist in a strange way for a couple of decades after it's actually completed as much as it was. We don't even know how it was dissimulated. There's a great book by Boaz Booth that I have back here about, it's a study of just what we know about how the Zohar actually got published and how it got disseminated out. And what we now think is that it was never disseminated out in one complete text. It was always parceled out in chunks, and those chunks kind of moved around. And one of the things the early printers had to do with the Zohar was collect all those chunks and then organize them into one text and then print that. So it was a mess. It was also just a mess of the text, even in terms of its dissemination. One of the texts that we do know of, however, that was incredibly popular was a very small section of the Zohar called the Sifra de Tzniuta, which is without a doubt the most complicated and bizarre section. It's only about 10 pages of the Zohar to read in Aramaic, but it's the most enigmatic section of the entire text. For whatever reason, this was really, really important to people, and that's a text that really traveled far and wide. It's an incredibly difficult to understand section. I've probably read it a dozen times, but I can tell you that even trying to summarize it right now, it would be fits and starts. It's so we do know that some sections of the Zohar proved very popular early on, and some sections didn't. So it wasn't even like it was received clearly in one kind of way. What we think happened was the Zohar was kind of sent out in digests, and people in various communities found certain parts interesting and certain parts not, and it was kind of spread out like this. In the generation after the publication of the Zohar, we basically have three major things that begin to happen. The first major thing that begins to happen in the aftermath of the publication of the Zohar, which everyone knew was important. Everyone realized it was an important document. Substantial, right? I mean, think about the documents we talked about so far in this class. They're 30, 40 pages long. This is 1,700 pages. This is a monumental text. Monumental text. So, regardless of what you thought about it, it was important. It wasn't just a 200-page, 100-page Sefer Bahir. This was a monumental piece of literature. So there were three basic reactions to it that followed in the aftermath. The first of it was, what does this text even mean? Remember, this text isn't even written in standard Hebrew. It's written in an obscure dialect of Aramaic, so obscure that you basically have to learn the dialect of Aramaic just to read it. It's not even in standard Babylonian Aramaic. It's an idiolect of Palestinian Aramaic. It's a very, very strange language. So just to try to figure out what it meant took about a generation. Secondly, many people did not buy it. They didn't believe it was real. They thought it was a forgery. There were many, many Jews that thought this document was a forgery, and it's dangerous. It's full of heretical, nonsense ideas, and it's going to get people to become pagans. And so we have, for instance, the very famous story of Itzhak of Akko, and he saw parts of the Zohar actually in Palestine, it reached him in Palestine, and he read it and thought, this is really weird. And if it's by Shimon Bar Yochai, I want to understand it for sure. So what did he do? He went all the way to Spain to try to find out where this thing came from. He did the detective work. He traced it. He went all the way back to Spain. He made it to Guadalajara. He made it to Leon. And he made it to Moshe Leon's wife. And Moshe Leon's wife ratted him out. She said, he made it up from his own head. It came from his own intelligence. And Isaac of Akko said, you mean to tell me he did not have any education? And she was like, no, he made it up. Now, what does make it up mean? Well, it might mean he was a fraud. It might also mean, according to other interpretations, that he had kind of mystical insight. And his mystical insight allowed him to kind of channel the Zohar, the same way that Joseph Smith channeled the Book of Mormon. That's a claim that people have made, right? The Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith never claimed he actually translated from gold plates. Joseph Smith claimed he used stones and looked into a hat and translated it spiritually. Well, maybe something, Moses of Leon did something similar to this. Because there were people actively trying to do investigative work to figure out whether this thing was real, right? Now, what's weird about Isaac of Akko is that eventually, toward the end of his life, he accepted the Zohar as legitimate. Despite what Moses of Leon's wife told him, he accepted it as legitimate. Now, legitimate, what does that mean? It's a big question. But he did ultimately come to accept it, but many people did not. The third thing is, once you understood what it's saying, once you can read the damn thing, well, how do you systematize it? What do these Sephirot mean? How do you understand all these different connections? How do you understand the 10 Sephirot track to various matriarchs and patriarchs, and are in these weird relationships, and they have all these complicated things that they're doing? How do you systematize this thing into a way of being Jewish? You can't just let it be a bunch of weird stuff. If it's the case, the Zohar is telling you that the entire purpose of this is the reparation of the world, the redemption of the world, the bringing forth of the Messianic age, you got to figure out how to do it. And the only way to figure out how to do it is to systemize the text so that you can understand what's happening. If you need to balance out 10 things, you need to know 10 things are, and how the 10 things relate, and how the mitzvot relate to those 10 things. So you can do the work of mystically aligning. So you're going to need people like encyclopedists. You're going to need people like systematizers. And that will be an entire generation, several generations of people that are going to be doing that work of systematizing. And the first of those great systematizers, right, is people like Abraham Gigatia. So Abraham Gigatia is a person living in Spain, his name, and he lived roughly the same right around the same time period, towards the end of the composition of the Zohar, and his work, the Sha'ar Ora, and there are some books earlier than him as well that are worth mentioning here, which most books do. But Joseph Igatius is probably either one of the earliest people to receive the Zohar as we have it now. He may have likely been in the circle of people composing it, but his work, Sha'ar Ora, the Gates of Light, is the earliest attempt to formally systematize the structure of the Sifra. So he's early on, right? So again, if you think about the Sacred Zohar being written in the 1280s, 1290s, 1270s, you can see he's right in that time in Spain. So he receives the Zohar, and he's one of the earliest systematizers. And his book, Sha'ar Ora, is one of the earliest attempts to systematize it. And also, this is one of the earliest books ever translated out of Hebrew into Latin to give access of the Kabbalah to Christians. In fact, if you've ever seen this image, that is the frontispiece for the translation by Rikius of Joseph Igatius' Sha'ar Ora. You can see it translated here as the Gates of Light, the Sha'ar Ora, right? So here we have it. And look, there we go. The earliest depiction of the Sphira. You can see it right there. Right. So this is a very early depiction of, right, this is supposed to be Shimon Bar Yochai, right? Holding up the tree of life. So this is an early ambit. Some folks have seen this picture before. You have the following lectures. This is the Resius translation of the Sha'ar Ora. All my slides. Yeah, there we go. So, Gugatia is one of the earliest systematizers. And that's going to be really important because the Zohar is very hard to understand, and systematizing is going to be very important in that process. Another really important early Kabbalistic document that's going to be important here is going to be Menachem Rekanti's commentary on the Zohar. And Rekanti's commentary on the Zohar is going to be what's going to be part of legitimating the Zohar, because Rekanti is one of the great scholars of his time. And he's also going to do the part of sort of transmitting Zoharic ideas in Italy. Right, so we have an Italian learning Kabbalah and translating some of those ideas into Italy. Man, this is going to be a big part of that. And once they get to Italy, they can spread everywhere, because Italy obviously is the hub of the world, and so they can get anywhere in the world at that point once they reach Italy. Also, things are making their way over to Morocco. This is also very important. Morocco is going to be an incredibly important spot for the development of Kabbalah. And we're just in the infancy of figuring out how that worked, how things got to Morocco. There was a huge Jewish community in Fez, and there was until the 20th century, basically. And so Moroccan Kabbalah is going to be its own branch of Kabbalah. And it's one of the things I would love to see in the entire book about is just the movement of Kabbalah to Morocco and the development of Moroccan Kabbalah, which is in many ways like many Kabbalah is a distinct form of Kabbalah. But the studies on that stuff is very primitive right now. They're very primitive. And you can imagine why. The archives are very difficult to access. To be able to read medieval manuscripts in 4 languages. It's tough. You basically have to be trained to do that job. And not many people are. So this is one of the spots that future scholarship is going to make us a lot more wise. Also, by the way, it's also going to decentralize Europe in a lot of ways. Because so much of what's going to happen is going to be Morocco and Iraq. We talk so much about Europe, but let me be very clear about this. European Kabbalah is one part of the story, and the reason why we know that part of the story so well is because a lot of Europeans have done that work so far. Do not be fooled that Kabbalah is a European-centric phenomenon. Do not let that be fooled. We just don't know about the rest. We haven't done the work yet. We don't have to do the work yet. We haven't prioritized the book. What's also important to know about the development of Kabbalah and what again I call the interregnum, the period between the writing of the composition of the Zohar and the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah, is that there were other Kabbalahs around. It wasn't like the Zohar was going to win. The Zohar was one weird document that was out there. People were interested in it, but it wasn't like it was going to be the only thing. At the same time with the Zohar, the version of the Kabbalah that was dominated by the Zohar, what we sometimes call Theosophical Kabbalah, There was another intellectual form of Kabbalah that developed, and this intellectual form of Kabbalah actually was much closer to philosophy. Remember that the Zohar has a very kind of don't like philosophy kind of bend, a little bit. There were other forms of Kabbalah that were developing. Remember, Kabbalah was developing in Spain, France, and other places, and there's another form of Kabbalah that's much more cozy with philosophy. In fact, they want to combine Maimonides philosophy, Neoplatonic philosophy, the Sefer Yetzirah. They want to combine all what's great about philosophy, all what's great about Kabbalah into one system. They don't want to kick. They don't want to kick Kabbalah. They don't want to kick philosophy to the road. They don't want to kick rationalism to the road. They want to actually blend them together. And so there are forms of Kabbalah that begin to develop, like I said, in Morocco and also in Spain, that are much more cozy with rationalism, with the intellect, with Maimonides even. And these forms of intellectual Kabbalah are completely distinct from what's going on in the realm of the Zohar. Now, you don't hear a lot about these because they lost. The Zohar is going to win, right? Glory is going to win. But these other forms of Kabbalah are just as legitimate, just as worth studying. Now, what ends up happening in these forms of Kabbalah is that the Sphirot are there. Right? These forms of Kabbalah accept the Sefer Yetzirah. They accept the Ego circle at some level. They said that the Sphirot are real, they're just not parts of God. They're parts of our intellect. They're the parts of God that actually are part of our intellect, that are the image of God inside of us. And so they're not metaphysical objects that are worthy of speculation out there. Right? The ladder is not from me to up there. The ladder is from in here to God. The ladder is in here. It's in the intellect. And you climb it in here. In your mind. In the intellect. Not ontologically out there. It's all in here. You go in, not up. In this form of Kabbalah, intellect is central. And what you do is that you go inside of your mind, and through a process of meditation, through a process of breathing techniques, through a process of writing out words and meditating on language, you begin to clear the mind. And as you begin to clear the mind of the nonsense, you begin to uncover the reality of God. And then you begin to climb up the Sphirot in your mind by uncovering the structures of the mind, the pure mind. And that pure mind is an imprint on you from God. And by climbing up the ladder of the intellect, your intellect becomes united with God. Notice this is a very different way of doing Kabbalah. It has everything to do with meditation. It has everything to do with contemplation, as opposed to following Jewish law. Now, you can't not follow Jewish law too. That's important, but this is a very different story. The apex of this form of Kabbalah we often call ecstatic Kabbalah. Ecstasis means to go out of yourself. This means second. Or we call it prophetic Kabbalah. And the most important example of this is, of course, Abraham Abelati. Right? Abraham Abelati, another Spaniard. Right? Born in Spain. Again, this is a thing that any Ashkenazi person should be very thankful for all the time Spartans have given us Kabbalah. Abraham Abelati was born around 1240, died around 1291, so born right around the time of the rise, contemporary of the rise of the Zohar. But his writings, you can't tell that he knows anything about it. He existed right around the time it was being written, but there's no evidence to anything about it, basically. He roamed around a whole lot. Abraham Abelati roamed around. Just to look at his travel log would make anyone jealous these days when it was locked down. She'll have to be able to travel around like Abkhazia. In fact, he traveled as far as Iraq and Iran, and he's trying to find a mystical river called the Sabbation. There's an idea that there's a mystical river called the Sabbation beyond which the 10 lost tribes of Israel gathered. And if you can find the river and bring them across, you can begin the process of redeeming the world and bringing in the Messiah. Very early on, Abelati had messianic schemes, one might call them. But the world was cast into chaos. If you look at the time period, right, 1240 to 1290, looking at the high point of the Crusades. So that wasn't a good time to be in that region. And so eventually he turns back. Abelati, aside from the Bible in many ways, and the Talmud had one text that he felt was very dear to him, and that was Maimonides' Guide to the Blessed. Now, most of us do not associate mysticism with Maimonides. Most of us do not associate mysticism with the God of the perplexed. In fact, if you ask most people what is the most anti-mystical text in the history of Judaism, they're going to tell you it's the God of the perplexed. Abelard will tell you the truth. It's hard. So around the age of 31, he returns to Spain after traveling around a long time, and he begins to have these, what he would call prophetic or ecstatic experiences. And this was brought on by some degree of mixing magical techniques that he probably adopted from the world of the Ashkenazi pietists, the Ashkenazi, and also some techniques that he's been developing from the Sefer Yetzirah. And what he ends up developing is a very complex system of breathing techniques, of letter combination techniques, of meditation techniques, and even body techniques. And many of these, I think, are being picked up from Sufism. Again, we're talking about the traveling Islamic world, and he's probably picking up some Sufi techniques. If you've ever seen the whirling dervishes and people like them who enter into trances by body breathing and spinning techniques, it seems very likely that Abulafia is picking up some of those kinds of techniques as well. And what ends up happening is Abulafia develops a prophetic form of Kabbalah. Now, this prophetic form of Kabbalah, which we have about a half a dozen books that he's written, the third least of which is a text called Sefer HaYashar, right? And these mystical insights that he gets, we'll talk more about how he achieves them in just a minute, but these mystical insights that he gets eventually convince him that he is, the Messiah. Which is always, as you probably know from Jewish history, the most dangerous thing you can believe you can be. If you want to get yourself killed, start believing you're the Messiah, and you'll be dead in no time. So he believes he's the Messiah, and of course, what he does is he does what any rational person does. He goes to Rome to tell the Pope that he's going to convert him to Judaism and begin the process of the redemption of the world. Well, the Pope basically orders him to be arrested and killed, and Abulafia's great luck is that the Pope dies. He has a stroke or something, he dies. And Abulafia is, I think, briefly arrested by the Dominicans or some such, and he's released. I don't know how he got that lucky, but, this happens, by the way, to several people in history. They challenge the Pope to this, to that, and whatever, and get themselves killed, and the Pope dies. So, again, not to hope anyone dies, much less the Pope, but I'm glad that Abraham Abulafia did not get to show down the Pope. Somebody out there crashed. Tabbed up the curse of the academic.
Is like stone, like the cement.
The Pope died. Good job. He would spend the rest of his career basically traveling around writing books, lecturing on the God of the perplexed, and basically saying that he was the Messiah. And eventually, towards the end of his life, some pretty important Jewish folks in the area of Sicily ultimately had him condemned by another Kabbalist, right? Shlomo ben Ibrit, who was a pretty famous Kabbalist at the time. He was friendly with Kabbalah, and he had him basically exiled, and he disappears from history in about 1291. So what ends up happening is Abulafia vanishes. We don't know what happened to him. He died or disappeared or become a cultic. He'll come back later and save us all. I don't know. Abulafia produced enormous amounts of works, prophetic works, commentaries on Moses, Moses Maimonides, God's Perplexed, and Sefer Yetzirah, and his combined works now comprise about 13 modern volumes. I have the works of Abulafia downstairs. Hebrew is about 13 volumes, although they're not terribly reliable. A critical edition of Maimonides' works is still something we need. It's still not there yet. And so Maimonides is one of these critically important mystics that we just don't have a complete works for in Hebrew, even in English, really, which is a disaster in a lot of ways, but maybe one day in our lifetime we'll have it. What makes Abulafia's work so important is that not only does he do philosophical speculation, he tells you how to do these techniques. He tells you the breathing techniques. He tells you the letter techniques. He tells you how to do the combinations. He tells you they are guidebooks. And those parts of the books rarely ever got printed because people were terrified of trying this stuff. Because Abalakio did this stuff and thought he was the Messiah. And people did not want that happening, so these sections of these books were hardly ever even reproduced in Hebrew. I do have them in Hebrew, and they're just complicated. It's all about combining letter values and stuff like that. Although I will say that recently there was a scholar named Moshe Hillel, one of the most important scholars of Kabbalah these days. Moshe Hillel did work with a neuroscientist to reproduce some of Abraham Abalakia's breathing and meditation techniques, and it showed on the neurological level, it showed results. He was changing people's brains. Right? So there is something to it. In the same way we study Zen monks' brains and nuns who chant, so there is something to it. How did this work? What he thought, right, and this is to get a little bit into the weeds of medieval philosophy, which I'm not going to do because I don't want to be a crazy person. But there's an idea coming from Aristotle that your intellect, right? So think about a bunch of dominoes. Imagine the universe is a bunch of dominoes. No domino can fall on its own. Some domino needs to knock the other dominoes down. And each domino has to be knocked over by another domino. So every domino is passive until another domino acts on it and knocks it down. And then that domino knocks it, and it becomes a new active domino. And it knocks the other passive domino down. Active, passive, active, passive, active, passive, active. Aristotle thought that the mind worked like that too. Your mind is passive at first. It needs something to activate it, but it can't activate itself. So what activates it? Another mind outside of it. It's like a domino clicking your mind on, or someone turning a light switch on. The light is passively on, or passively there, and we click the light, and we are the active light up, and then the light shines. Well, Aristotle thought that there must be something outside the mind that lights the mind up. Your mind is passive, and something activates it. What's that active thing that lights the mind up? Another mind. What mind? God's mind. God's mind turns the light on in your mind, illuminates your mind. Well, often our minds are kind of full of gunk, right? I mean, think about your day. Do you really think about how your mind is a realm of God? No, you think about paying the bills, getting the kids, doing the thing, and getting some food, and doing whatever teaching class. Your mind's covered over with all kinds of layers of things that make you forget what you want. You're a mind activated by God's mind. Well, what is the technique that Abalaki developed? A way of clearing off the gunk. So that your mind reaches all the way back up to the divine mind, and then your mind and God's mind become connected again. And when that happens, when your mind and God's mind become connected, you see like God does. You see time as one thing. Right? You're now no longer in third dimension, you're in four dimensions, and you see time. You can look that way into the past, and look that way into the future. That's prophecy. You can see how things are going to go, you can see how things went. You can see where you are, you see from a God's eye perspective. Your mind becomes connected to God's mind at some level. And Abalaki tried to develop meditation techniques and language techniques to reconnect your mind to God's mind. Now notice how this is very different than the Zohar. The Zohar is a very different animal. You are trying to climb back up something, but in a very, very different way. In fact, even Abalaki gives us phenomenological characteristics to let us know we're on the right path. He says when you start doing this correctly, your body will emit light. You'll see a double of yourself in front of you, like another you, your cell, your astral body communicating with you. And eventually you'll have a terrifying moment. You'll break through to pure joy, right? And once you break through to pure joy, you're then jettisoned up to the divine mind. By the way, this sounds a lot like Zen Buddhism in a lot of ways, and many people have drawn a lot of comparisons between Zen Buddhism and Abalaki's meditation techniques. So, this how-to aspect of Abalaki's work was always viewed with a lot of suspicion by a lot of Jews because of how Abalaki turned out, and also because it's the idea of joining with God is a very controversial idea in Judaism because the idea that God is transcendent and you're not. That's a weird thing to do. But Abalaki's ideas were incredibly interesting, and eventually his ideas will get redeemed back into mainstream Kabbalah. And I would say that now, Kabbalah, these ideas are being brought back in and synthesized at some level with ideas from the Zohar. But you can see they're very different ideas. And I bet you can see these are very different ways of doing Kabbalah. These are fundamentally different ways of doing Kabbalah. But what's important about this is to know that what the Kabbalah was in 1300, 1350 was not sorted out then. They were Kabbalahs. And because they were Kabbalahs, it could have gone lots of ways. But eventually it's going to go. We'll talk about that way. We'll talk about the way in just a second. Or I'll talk about it now. The most important event in the history of the Kabbalah is the Alhambra Decree, which, as I'm sure all of you know, the Alhambra Decree was the decree of the Spanish monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, over there in my collection, who banned all Jews from living in Iberia beginning in the summer of 1492. Of course, the enactment of the Alhambra Decree took effect on Tishba of that year. So, add injury to insult. And what ends up happening is that, like in many cases, as we talked about early on in this class, when something really bad happens to the Jews don't get running, the Jews get apocalyptic. So when bad stuff happens, apocalypse kind of comes in and say, "Hi guys, I'm here for you." And so this apocalyptic fervor begins to emerge in Judaism again with the Alhambra Decree, and that apocalyptic fervor is combined with the Kabbalah. Now, if you can't imagine a more spicy thing than that, I don't know what you can think of. Kabbalah plus apocalypse is like, that's the bee's knees, y'all. That's the thing. And so they begin to combine these ideas. Not only that, there's an idea that God had sent the Kabbalah to prepare the Jews for 1492 with the Alhambra Decree, and that the Alhambra Decree was the beginning of the end of the world, the whole damn thing, or the beginning of at least the Messianic era, and that Kabbalah was how to bring it home. So what was previously, before 1492, a very carefully guarded, secretive world of Kabbalah, after 1492, the new idea was, we need to popularize this, because by popularizing it, we will herald the Messiah. Kabbalah is the road. Kabbalah is like the rug that we lay out for the Messiah. We got to roll the rug out. How we roll the rug out? By popularizing these ideas, by intensifying our devotion to this new idea, right? Which again, to them wasn't new, right? They really believed it was ancient. And to wit, because they believed that it was ancient, because they really believed the Zohar really all came all the way from Shimon Bar Yochai, where did they go to settle when they were exiled? Many of them were collected by Bayez II, who also have a point from. Bayez II was the Ottoman Turk emperor, who was incredibly gracious. He sent his entire fleet to rescue Jews who were being exiled from Spain. Again, this is one of these things where we should tell the story very clearly that this is a case where Muslims saved Jews. Bayez II recognized this as a very important thing for his empire, and he brought Jews all the way to the Ottoman Empire. By the way, in 1492, there was no printing presses in the Ottoman Empire. In 1493, there was one in Salonika, set up by Jews. So Bayez II was very, very intelligent in this regard. He knew that rescuing the Jewish population would be good for his empire. And so many Jews who came from Spain after 1492, after the Alhambra Decree, where did they go? They were Kabbalists. They first went to Jerusalem, and then where did they go? They went home. Where is home? The Galilee, where Shimon Bar Yochai is from, the author of the Zohar. Now think about how interesting this is. This is a document written by someone that's not actually from Palestine, a Spaniard, in that you have an entire population moving to Israel, Palestine. They land in Jerusalem, and they settle in the area of their hero, Shimon Bar Yochai, Meron and Sfat. And if you know anything about Meron and Sfat, you know that is now, to this day, the center of Kabbalah. They built a center where there was none prior. They built an entire world for themselves, and they lived it. It's an amazing mystical story. In the world of the Ottoman Empire, the Kabbalah is about to undergo a titanic change. So some of the earliest important systematizers of Kabbalah at this time was Meir Ibn Gabbai. Miriam Gabbai, he wrote one of the earliest systematic accounts of Kabbalah as we have it. But the most important systematizer of Kabbalah is going to be at this time Moses ben Yaakov Cordovero. And he's going to write, published in 1548, his Pardes Romain. And this is the most encyclopedic, most coherent, and most systematic account of Zohar Kabbalah to be produced, basically in some ways, ever. And just to briefly summarize how he thinks, some of the things he thinks, he imagines the Sefirot as emerging from a kind of dialectic. That is to say, they always contain their opposite, and their opposite breaks off of them. Have you folks ever seen how cells undergo like mitosis? Right? Is it mitosis where cells break away from each other? Right? Where they sort of, you see them like doing a thing, and they, right? And they, right? He imagines that all the Sefirot, the Ein Sof contained a contradiction, and that from that contradiction emerged Sefirah, and then that contained all the contradictions of Ein Sof. It broke again, broke again. So what we have in the ideas of Cordovero is we actually have a reason why the Sefirot developed the way they did. For him, there's an inner dynamism even inside each Sefirah, and that's going to get turned up to the max. We'll get to encyclopedia here next time. So he's trying to systematize why the Zohar works the way the Zohar works. Why does Sefirot obey rules? What are the rules the Sefirot obey? How do they work? And why are they the way that they are? So he's the great systematizer. Another major work that he has is a text called Or Yakar. Or Yakar is a commentary on all the Zohar literature. In fact, this commentary is so vast that a modern edition is still not done yet. There is no modern edition of the Or Yakar. They're still putting it out in Hebrew. I think it's running 24 volumes at this point. I mean, he spent decades working on it. It may be done in our lifetime. The modern edition may be done in Hebrew in our lifetime. English edition is not even on the radar. Just to get a standard Hebrew edition done. This work is so massive. It's nothing been in the works since the 60s, and I think it's still not done. There are 24 volumes. It's a massive document. Another work that he produced was a document called the Tomer Devorah, the Palm Tree of Devorah. This is an ethical, very tiny little book, very, very tiny little book. You can read it in an afternoon. And this is an ethical version of Kabbalah. This is trying to understand Kabbalah as an ethical program, how to be a Kabbalistic informed Jew. And these ethical Kabbalistic books, these kind of books of Kabbalistic Musar, ethics, how to be a Kabbalist, how to be a Kabbalistically informed Jew. In fact, many of those are responsible for popularizing a lot of Kabbalistic ideas. In fact, some people ask me, what Kabbalistic book would you read first? And I tell them, from the advice of a friend of mine, that I would say Tomer Devorah. If you want to read any system of Kabbalah, in many ways, from a philosophic point of view, more than I appreciate encyclopedias. Now, I know you're not supposed to say that because encyclopedia is the base need of everything in all time. I will say the Cordovero system I find much more rigorous, much more systematic, much more philosophically involved. So I appreciate Cordovero a great deal. Now, his elder brother-in-law, right, was Shlomo Alkabetz. Now, you may have never heard of Shlomo Alkabetz, but I bet you sung a song he wrote, a little ditty called Lecha Dodi. If you ever practice Kabbalat Shabbat, the service on a Friday night to welcome in Shabbat, if you've ever sung Lecha Dodi, you've engaged in Kabbalah. Congratulations. The entire service of Kabbalat Shabbat was invented by the circle of people like Joseph Alkabetz, right, and people like Cordovero and people like Joseph Caro. They invented that entire service. That entire service was invented in a whole cloth by Kabbalists. And Lefadodi is the high point of that service, and it's a Kabbalistic hymn to the Shabbat as Shekhinah. So, also he developed some of the all-night study sessions that became important to the development of the holiday of Shavuot. If you've ever done a tikkun on Shavuot, we stayed up all night. Those kinds of ideas are also to be found in ideas of people like Shlomo Alkabetz and other folks. In fact, Alkabetz and Joseph Caro, who we'll talk about in just a second, they moved to Palestine because a spirit, an entity, a Magid, a preacher, the Shekhinah, told them they had to relocate to Palestine and go to Tzfat. Joseph Caro, who you probably know more famously as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the definitive document of Jewish law. Definitive. There is no more important document in Jewish legal history than the Shulchan Aruch. It was produced by Joseph Caro, a Kabbalist of this time period, who saw visions of the Magid, sometimes as the Shekhinah, sometimes as an embodied version or a spiritual version of the Mishnah, the rabbinic text. And so much of modern Judaism, whether it's the legal text like Shulchan Aruch, or whether it's ritual stuff like Kabbalat Shabbat, or it's musical stuff like Chadodi, or it's other things, all of this is being formed and fused and hewn and developed in the 16th century in the aftermath of the 1492 disaster of the Alhambra Decree. It's being developed by Kabbalists to popularize ideas from the Sacred Zohar, to basically roll out a red carpet for the coming of the Messiah. They are popularizing these ideas as part of a messianic redemption arc in their mind. So these ideas, which were very closely hidden, are now being published, put out there, rendered out there. Make songs out of it. If you've ever been to a Friday night service in any synagogue ever, you are living in the shadow of these people doing Kabbalah in the hopes of using ideas from the Zohar to welcome and herald the Messiah. Now, I don't know if you knew that you were doing that or care, but you were. So, Kabbalat Shabbat and Friday night services begin here in Tzfat, right? At this level, begin here in Tzfat, and they are imbued deeply. Go read Lefadodi. Go read the English translation for it. It's all about welcoming the bride, getting married to Shabbat, form the Shekhinah, etc. It's Kabbalistic all day long. The Zohar itself is also now reaching its canonization at some level. It's printed for the first time in Italy at the printing of Cremona, although that printing is not very widely recognized. It's only ran for a few volumes. But the definitive edition was also printed just around the same time at Mantua. And the Mantua edition became the standard version. The 3-volume version of Mantua became the standard edition. So the Zohar is now being printed. So the printing of the Zohar actually was precipitated at least first by Christians, and then the Mantua edition is going to rapidly assimilate the ideas of Kabbalah all through the world, especially the European one. Cordovero's work is going to be soon surpassed by Isaac Luria. We'll get to him next time. What ends up happening is Cordovero dies, as we all will, and Luria comes to Tzfat the very day Cordovero died. The Ramak died. And above the funeral train of Cordovero, of the Ramak, Yitzhak Luria saw a pillar of fire reaching up into heaven. Now, if you know something about the book of Exodus, the book of Exodus describes God appearing to the Israelites as a pillar of fire. Literally, Isaac Luria says, Cordovero, God is literally going with Cordovero on his funeral train. And immediately Yitzhak Luria joins the train. Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal, the lion comes to Spot and spends only a few years in Spot before he dies. He only spends, but the few years he spends in Spot before he dies very young. I think he only like 40 or something when he dies. He spends a few years teaching, and the 3 or 4 years that he spent in Spot, or the 2 or 3 years he spent in Spot, are going to transform Kabbalah forever. The teachings that he imparts to 2 of his students, one is Chaim Vital, the other is another student called Israel Sarug, who's not as well known. But between Sarug and Chaim Vital, really more Chaim Vital, Kabbalah is going to become a completely integrated part of Jewish theology, philosophy, and Jewish law. Kabbalah, as we know it, is going to basically become Lurianic Kabbalah. The Kabbalah, as we all know it, is going to be the Kabbalah downstream of Itzhak Luria and Chaim Vital. And what ends up emerging is that Chaim Vital's version of the Kabbalah is very peculiar interpretation, which we'll get to next time, becomes the authentic, definitive, final version of Kabbalah. That's a huge deal. He will set the stage for all further Kabbalistic speculation. Now, what's also important here is that the Christians have taken notice also of Kabbalah. They've also gotten interested in this messianic fervor. And they've also gotten interested in the idea that Jews may have had some weird secrets from way back in the day. Jews at this point, beginning of the 15th century, especially by the 16th century, are taking intense interest in Kabbalah. And they're going to actually adopt Kabbalah to Christianity. And Christian Kabbalah is going to be an incredibly important part of the development of what we now call Western esotericism, or the occult. So if you've ever studied magic, things like that, these ideas are going to be incredibly important when we get to Christian esotericism and the rise of occultism, right, in Europe. We'll get to that next time as well. It's going to be Vital, Chaim Vital, one of Itzhak Luria's students, who is going to provide the definitive version of Kabbalah as we know it. If you've ever studied Kabbalah, you've heard phrases like Tzimtzum, contraction, Tikkun Olam, the reparation of the world, Shira, right, the idea of the shattering of the vessels, Klipot, the idea that there are broken vessels, there are shards of these vessels. If you've ever heard any of these ideas come from Lurianic Kabbalah. They are versions of Kabbalah developed by Luria based on the sacred Zohar. What we're going to do next week is we're going to dive into Lurianic Kabbalah. Lurianic Kabbalah, as I said just a moment ago, is Kabbalah. It's become the baptized version, if you like. It's the definitive, the authentic, the standard version. There were other versions of Kabbalah that existed prior, but Lurianic Kabbalah will become the canonical Kabbalah. So notice what's already happened. By the late 16th century, the Zohar is already accepted as canon. There's no doubt anymore basically about it. The question is, how do we interpret it correctly? Luria is going to become the canonical version of Kabbalah. That's a big deal. Because something that is, at this point, from 1572, Kabbalah is only about 300 years old. 1270s is when it first began to emerge, really. And by 1572, with the death of Isaac Luria, it's going to become definitive. So by 300 years, the Zohar is scripture. And it's going to affect every version of Jewish life, from the Siddur, prayer book, to the liturgy, Kabbalah Shabbat, to ritual life, putting on tefillin during Chol Moed, even Jewish law. It's going to affect all these things. And the Lurianic Kabbalah will be the standard mechanism by which all other forms of Kabbalah will be measured in the future. So we'll come back next week, and we'll begin the process of handling the Lurianic Kabbalah. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
Oh, sorry, bro. If I go